a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, archivists, story keepers, and all of you black sheep of your families, of which there are many if you're writing memoir. Welcome to Right Minded. I am Brooke Warner, and I'm here with Grant Faulkner. And Grant, we're just kind of going to go to the heart of an important subject that many memoirists grapple with. And I imagine it's probably a subject that some novelists circle as well. But it's about this idea of leaving the past alone, or as the case may be, not. And as I'm wont to do, I listen to the book, The Manicurist's Daughter. It's such a great audiobook, by the way. And this is the book of today's guest, Susan Lieu. But as I made my way through the book, all I could think about was that Susan, for whatever reasons, her psychology, maybe her birth order, maybe how old she was when her mother died, could be her personality, but she wasn't at peace, and of course she lost her mom when she was very young. So how could you be? But then she spent her whole life, writing, researching, creating, making sense of the past. And I found it touching and beautiful, because it really is a way that she deeply honors her mom through her work. But I also got to wondering why it is that some people can't escape the past, and circle it and write about it and create around it, whereas others totally move on. And I just wonder what your thoughts might be on that subject, especially since we are working in the land of writers.
Yeah, and just for the sake of our listeners, I want to lay out the context of the book a little bit, which is that Susan lost her mom, as you said, when she was just 11 years old. And that was in the aftermath of plastic surgery, of all things, that went wrong. And her mother essentially lost oxygen to her brain. And the doctor who was performing the surgery didn't call 911 until 14 minutes after she lost oxygen. And after that, she was in a coma that she was never going to come out of. And she was only 38 years old and a mother of 4. But to address your question, Brooke, I suppose we can't know or make sense of why some people are predisposed not to be able to move on. And I absolutely agree that it's those people who are the storytellers, who come to memoir and sometimes to fiction to sort out what happened and why it matters. And Susan in her book speaks to being the black sheep of the family, as you mentioned, Brooke. And I know that's something we hear a lot from writers we work with, that their families can't understand their obsessions. And that can make the writing process, all the more difficult. And I think I chalk it up to people's sensitivities and also to life circumstances. We spoke with Faith Adiele recently, who said that she was the only child, the only young person, and the only brown person in her family. And we spoke with Liz Rosner, who spoke about being almost like a spy in her own family. And I think these desires to know and to understand start so young. And I think part of the answer to your question is that we're writers because we're overwhelmed with the questions of our lives and need to try to answer them. And then we unearth those questions because we're writers and we're more sensitive, more tuned to those questions. So I think it's kind of a hazard and a benefit of our métier.
Yeah, it's so true. And Susan in the book speaks periodically to how her family thinks she's sensitive, she's emotional, and that's something, of course, I hear from memoirists all the time, that they're accused in some way of, being more emotional than other people. Mm-hmm. And of course, like our desire to know or understand is interconnected with our desire to be known or understood. And I think that is what calls people to the page, so more often than not, if you're hanging out with a writer or you are a writer, maybe you're just a person who's sort of predisposed to excavating. And Susan writes about this in her book, and she also talks about it in today's interview, that her mom died and then no one talked about it, right? Like no one talked about her mom after that. And so it's not only this massive loss, but it's a hole in her life, and then no one's even acknowledging it. And I have read so many memoirs that I have seen this, I've seen it reiterated in other people's stories. I think there's all kinds of reasons that happens. People don't know how to act. They don't know what to say. They're traumatized, as Susan will mention today. And I also think, what happens when someone like Susan writes about it, is that it does tap into a collective nerve of other people who have lived with family silence. And that's its own form of trauma, to have such a loss and you're not really able to grieve because you're not talking about it. You're not remembering, you're not having, or maybe you are remembering, but you're not collectively remembering. And you're not having your pain acknowledged. And so I really love this book for how it goes into the heart of these topics. But there's also body image and beauty standards because of the way that her mom died. And so it's got all this stuff of intergenerational trauma and loss, but it's also got this much more particular level, about the pursuit of something that's impossible to attain. I love this kind of multi-layeredness in memoir. And I also love subject-specific memoirs like these, that get into particular issues that matter, whether it's, beauty standards, but she is also talking about the exploitation of immigrants, because the doctor who operated on her mother was a white doctor in San Francisco advertising in Vietnamese language newspapers. And so there's just a lot going on in this story, and just a strong one for those of you out there who are looking for a good memoir to read, by way of example of how to do it well.
Yeah, I agree, Brooke. And maybe that's when you have a memoir in your hands. I mean, you can write about anything when it comes to memoir, but I think the industry is always looking for the big picture things that are central to memoir, like trauma and loss and grief and love, etc. And then there's a question of what else is in the mix. And Susan's story is sad and tragic. This was a loss that obviously shouldn't have happened. And it's incredibly complex because she shares how her family was very body conscious, how she was criticized for her weight and for her belly fat, even though that's literally what killed her mother, and these things can be just so deeply ingrained in us that we can't see. And that's the work of the writer, to call it out and bring it out into the open. And I really marveled at Susan's willingness to tackle these topics and to position herself as the kind of the clear-eyed one in her family without at all making herself superior. And there's an acknowledgement of the dynamics at play that have everything to do with gender and culture and her parents being immigrants and propriety. And there's just so much to weigh as she, forges forward in her search for her own truth. And somehow she manages to get all of that on the page.
Yeah, for sure she does. And, Grant, when I was thinking about Susan and her book, I was remembering when we interviewed Danny Shapiro, and that topic that we talked about with her was obsession, and this idea of kind of a healthy obsession, because a lot of times obsession is so framed as something negative. But if you're obsessed with having lost a parent especially at a young age, there's nothing wrong with coming back to that subject again and again and again. And lots of times that's just the stuff of our writing material. And it's, so true for the myriad things people write about. Like I was thinking about abuse, for instance, that's a trauma that would be a defining factor in anyone's life. And I think we need to be mindful when we're writing memoir about not beating ourselves up too much for coming back to things again and again. Or when people say, why are you stuck in the past, that you have a way to honor yourself, that this is stuff that you're sorting through. Because I was thinking about in my own memoir in progress. It's an obsession for me. Like what happened in my relationship with my ex, that the bottom dropped out from under us, and, how this thing that happened to her 30 years earlier was really in some ways responsible for our demise. And there's just so much complexity, and so much wanting to circle it and make sense of it. And I don't think that there's really going to ever be a sense that I'll uncover anything dramatically new. And yet I loved what we talked about with Susan today, this idea that your story kind of changes, or it is unveiled, that it, has deeper layers as you do the writing. And I think this is really the power of writing and telling our stories.
Totally. And I think you've hit it on the head, that the ultimate subject of life is, what's irreconcilable, and how we reconcile ourselves with that. And I'm thinking of this because my daughter's currently going through her first, major breakup with her boyfriend, and dealing with her pain has made me think of all the breakups in my life, because I was always the one who was broken up with, not the one doing the breaking up. And I've never been able to understand how love can go from love to not love, so quickly, kind of seemingly overnight. That's how it can feel, and it's a terrifying feeling, and one that's nearly impossible to grasp or accept. So our brain goes into, these endless loops to try to understand this thing that's really impossible to fathom. And it makes me think also of, earlier this year, I read the poet Christian Weeman, who is known, he's kind of called an atheist Christian poet. He's kind of both deeply religious and deeply secular at the same time. Hard to reconcile even that, but he makes him a really interesting writer. And he was writing about Jesus's question on the cross, And Jesus says, everyone knows this, "Oh Lord, why have you forsaken me?" And that's the feeling we've all felt and had to grapple with. Why are we being forsaken by either our loved ones or our once loving world or God? And how do we reconcile ourselves to that new world in order to recreate it and hopefully no longer feel forsaken.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's there's just a lot of depth to get into here, and to your daughter, it's just so hard. I was thinking like first loves, first breakups, and yet those are the things that shape us and provide the material of our life stories. And on that note, I'm super eager to hear from Susan about her story, her process, and all of her thoughts on all these multi-layered topics that we're speaking about. And we will be right back after this short break. Welcome back, everyone. We're so thrilled to have Susan Lieu with us. She is a multi-hyphenate storyteller, activist, and author. Through her book, podcast, and live performances, Susan takes audiences on a journey of healing, intergenerational trauma, embracing authenticity, and finding boldness in vulnerability. Susan is the creator of her theatrical solo show, 140 Pounds, How Beauty Killed My Mother, which received critical acclaim from the LA Times, NPR, and American Theater. Her debut memoir is called The Manicurist's Daughter. It is an Apple Book Pick of the Month and a must listen of the month, and has received numerous accolades. And what's not in your bio here is your amazing TED Talk, which is, I take it, pretty recent. So congratulations. It already has almost 50,000 views. Susan, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're thrilled. So, your work is about a lot of things, but your mother is really the central figure in your one-woman show, in your memoir, obviously plays a role in almost all the things that you do. And so can you share with us your process of coming to terms with your mother being your primary subject? Or, I don't know if you would call her your muse, but I'm guessing you would.
Yeah, she was the primary subject because after she died from a botched tummy tuck when I was 11 and she was 38, she was not the primary subject anymore. My family never talked about her or her death to this day, and it's almost been 3 decades. So it's kind of a very interesting thing when someone, like the main pillar in your life, is now taken away and now made invisible, right? Because the more I reach, the more I ask my family about her, the more they're like, you're too emotional. You're living in the past. Stop. And they're telling me this now when I'm like 12, right? And so I couldn't help but for her to become the primary subject because we were avoiding her, because there was so much shame and silence around her. And I think for me, it really kind of came to a head when, after I got married, my dad and aunts were like, have babies, have babies, have babies. And I was like, whoa, like, how do I become a mother if I never knew my own? And then there was this concurrent issue inside of me where I was like, how do I tell my kid, be what you want in life, if I did it myself? And what I was referring to is I had started in stand-up comedy years prior and things were going great. I got a taste of the stage and I loved it. I got heckled and then I ran away. And so for me, there was this dual track that was happening that kind of forced me into becoming an artist and becoming a playwright and a performer and an author, is because I had to face the very thing that has been taken away for so long. If I could not face it head on, then I could not move forward. And then that's why I write about her. And honestly, guys, if only my family could have a conversation about her, this all wouldn't have needed to happen. Right? Like, nobody wanted me to talk about our family mess. They still don't. But it's like I had to, so I could finally move forward.
Well, that's so interesting. And I'm very curious about this question, why can't you let the past stay in the past? Because we have so much in our culture that tells us to move on, and to let things go. And I think that obviously, as you just said, that's not the place to be, especially with something like this. So I was wondering if you can share more about your thoughts about, that particular form of criticism, and if it felt like criticism, and then what you really learned from not letting the past stay in the past. And it's an ongoing thing, it sounds like.
There's a line in the memoir where I was like, when no one would talk about her, that's when she truly died for me. I think 11-year-old Susan didn't really understand why no one would want to talk about the past. 39-year-old Susan, who now has a 4-year-old, is like, oh, I get it. Like, people were so afraid that if they did talk about the past, they did talk about her, they wouldn't know how they would be. Like, they wouldn't know what their emotional state was going to be in. And if they would have the capacity to deal with it. I mean, there's also I need to underscore that in Vietnamese culture, like mental health is heavily stigmatized. And that as boat people from Vietnam, my dad and his generation, they had a lot of unresolved PTSD, right? So then to couple that with major grief around the most important person in our life, it was just, no one wanted to face it because it was just too big, right? But the response was like, Susan, you're being a burden, you're being a nuisance, you're being a problem. And I think like as a young child and as they're my elders, like I had to listen and obey, and I believe they were right, which made me wrong, right? Which made me inherently bad. And it was their narrative that I had to live up to, right? Of like, I need to believe this so we could have this collective harmony, right? Like we're also Confucian, we're also Buddhist, and that's what was going to preserve all of this. I think I had to realize that like we were the walking dead. Like we were zombies in our own lives because we were ignoring the biggest elephant in the room. And for me, it's like, how many more dysfunctional relationships, romantic ones, do I need to stay in way too long? Because I had abandonment stuff around my mom's death. You know what I mean? Like how many more times did I have to, spoiler alert, join a cult to find some sense of belonging that I don't have in my own family because I wasn't actually reconciling with the past. And so for me, the past was not the past. The past was always haunting my present.
Yeah, it's so well articulated, Susan, and you really see that in the book. And I wanted to talk about the one woman show because, first of all, it's such a courageous thing to do. And I know you said you're into stand-up comedy, and so clearly you were drawn to the stage. But I wonder if you could share about how the show informed the memoir. Like, what was the intersection of those two things? And did the memoir come about as a result of the show, or did you have to, do a book proposal and pitch the memoir because, that was like the next story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah. So my solo show, 140 Pounds, How Beauty Killed My Mother, the one that I had the world premiere and took on a 10-city national tour, that was the fifth iteration. That was the fifth iteration of me knowing what happened. The first iteration was 25 minutes. I was super angry. I asked my husband, like, what did you think? And he was like, babe, you like cried the whole time. And I was like, okay. And, but it was the anger of not knowing how my family felt. It was the anger that I wanted to avenge my mother's death by making the negligent plastic surgeon pay. Someone had come up to me after the show and he was like, that was really sad, but like, who is your mom? The only time we see your mom is when she's in this coma and Susan's reaching for her and begging her to come back. And I was like, Ben, like, I don't know. And so these different shows, I would answer different questions about her body image stuff. I would go do research and come back and process it live on stage. Of course, I would write drafts to get to those scripts to get to the final part, right? But like, so what I'm trying to tell you is each of these shows was me learning something new, or me retracing her last day and then making a show from it, or going back to Vietnam and finding new information, making a show. The fifth one was this compilation of knowing it all, right? And also me playing 15 characters in 65 minutes, which means me playing my family and trying to show the complexity of what they've never shown me before, of how they felt. So now I have this tight package of like a narrative arc, right? With a beginning, middle, and end, and a journey that Susan goes on, and it's tight. And that becomes the proof of concept that becomes the book. So it was more of an unconventional path, I would say. It wasn't I wrote something on modern love and it got published and that was so amazing. Or like I did query the 100 agents and then I kept fine tuning my work, right? Like this one was, I have this story to tell and it's bursting out of me on stage, even though I have no theater training. And now a series of wonderful things happened and I kept jumping over each hurdle for me then to get the book deal.
Susan, I love hearing that story and the trajectory of that story. And I'm thinking about like where so many writers at their starting point, and I'm thinking of this idea of airing dirty laundry that you mentioned in your memoir a few times, and you just use the word family mess. When you first start dealing with the airing of that dirty laundry, it actually sounds so pleasant, right? Airing some dirty laundry, but it's super tough to do that. And without knowing the end point too, that it all, that you get this acclaim and this attention, and your story gets out there and it has many cathartic moments. So I'm just curious, what advice do you have for that writer who's just starting out to air the dirty laundry of their family, and how they're, that naturally experiencing the struggle of other people's judgments? What would you tell them?
It will feel lonely. It will feel lonely because everyone's still trying to protect themselves, and how your family shows up, even though it might not make sense and it might not feel good. That's actually what their best looks like, because we're all dealing with our own demons, which is unfortunate because it might not come out in the kindest way. But I got to say, you got to do this for you, right? It's not like, so I can bring the family together so that we can be closer, because I used to have that intention. And guess what? It's not in my control. And so the question is like, what is it that you must do for you to heal you? And for me, it's like, one of my values is integrity, and for me, I needed to have integrity with myself before I went on this mother journey. And so I was pulled and finally motivated by a new way, not like, why are you guys withholding information from me? It's more like, for me to go on this big journey to be a mom, I had to do my work. And this was part of my work, independent of my family. I remember when I first came back from the first show, the first iteration of my show was called Dr. X, How I Avenged My Mother's Death, episode 1. And I come back to our Christmas sleepover. It's 5 days. It's called Extreme Indulgence. I go with all my siblings. We go to Tahoe. We all make food. And whoever makes the best meal gets their name and the meal inscribed on our trophy. Okay, it's like very serious. And I was like, hey guys, do you guys want to watch this recording of my first show? And 2 siblings said no. And 1 sibling watched it. And he was like, well, it was like an emotional roller coaster. And I'm waiting for this conversation. I'm waiting for all of it to go down. And then my brother just goes upstairs to watch football. So it was this gut punch, right? Where I was like, wow, again, more rejection, again, more abandonment, again, black sheep. But guess what? By the 3rd iteration, and with the help of Cindy the psychic, my sister becomes this bridge builder, right? Because for us, we believe in spirit channeling. We do believe in psychics as long as you verify that they're legit. And she was able to get a message from my mom that this was not just about Susan wanting attention, but that this was about me and my mom doing the work as healers for ourselves and for the greater community. My sister heard that, and it changed her perspective on it. And then she came to a show and she became more open, and she was the bridge builder in the family to reassure them that this is like, what Susan's doing is mostly okay, right? Like, so I'd say for the person who is airing that dirty laundry, is that, can you identify someone in the family that could be your bridge builder? That is open, but maybe they are scared, right? Like for me, it's what was I modeled when I was a kid? Full house, like I wanted all our family conversations to end with the hug and the nice cue of the music, and it doesn't. Mm. And I had this expectation and it was not happening, but perhaps there's someone who's open, and perhaps that person doesn't like very large group settings and might need more one-on-one time, and might need to be eased in to understand your intentions, right? So it's, yes, do the work for you. Find that bridge builder. But also you got to go through. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they say we're only as sick as our secrets. And so if we want to keep upholding this illusion of the secrets, that everything in the family is fine, and we uphold the secrets, how's that working out for you? And if you want a different default reality, you're going to have to make changes for yourself. You may not be able to change other people, but here's the exciting, hopeful thing. When you change yourself, you change your own dynamic within yourself. And it is only inevitable that you will then change the dynamic with other people. It's like gears in a clock. Once you start moving a different way, everyone's going to flex to you. It might not be fast. It might not be immediate, but it's a shift. It's a 2-degree turn. And then you've catapulted the change.
Nice. Speak it, sister. I love it. It's so great. I'm glad that you brought up this idea that you write about of avenging your mother's death and the plastic surgeon, because he plays a big role. And I'm curious to ask you this question because one maxim of memoir writing is never to do revenge writing, you know, and of course you write about the wrongdoing of the doctor who was responsible, but I imagine that it took some iterations, you know, to move from like full blown seeing red revenge, you know, to writing in a more nuanced way. But there is all this fantasy about exacting revenge and all of this stuff. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to that for other people who, you know, that's central to their story when people might be telling you like, you know, don't go there.
Yeah. You know, I didn't even realize that this was a family story. I thought this was a revenge story while I was doing theater. Until I'm like, this is about the doctor. This is about the doctor. And like, I remember my first show, I made a program where I actually like had a picture of my mom on the front and inside was the expose about the doctor and my mom. And then when everyone left the show, I actually handed them his obituary. I was very focused on the doctor. I thought, if I make him pay, I will have closure. Well, guess what, friends? You can't really make an enemy pay when you find out they're dead. And it was when I found out he was dead, and then when I tried to reach out to his family and they like engaged and then disengaged, and then my back was up against the wall. I was like, well, how am I going to get closure? And that's when one of my directors was like, well, you're only get closure because this is about you and your family. And it was like explosion in my brain. I was like, this is about my family. I thought this was about him. I thought this was about suing him and getting money for my dad. I thought this was about that. And so it's actually really interesting in doing the theatrical work and writing out all the scripts and going on that quest and then putting it on stage is that I actually had to go through that individual journey to understand that this was a family story. I initially never thought it was a family story because my family is like, don't talk about the family. Right. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to obey and just talk about the doctor. Right. Because saving face in Asian culture is so important. And so like the fact that I eventually started to focus on my family was like the very thing I should not do. Right. It was easier for me to focus on the doctor and more palatable to like figure out how I'm going to like prop up a billboard by his clinic so he knows I'm like waiting for him and watching for him. Like that seemed more rational to me than actually having a conversation with my family. So what I'm trying to say here is that I had to go through my own evolution to realize that this was a family story because it was the very thing I wasn't allowed to talk about. Do you get what I'm saying? Like it was
totally.
If I could, it would have been the revenge story. but if it was a revenge story, I don't think that the play would have resonated with so many people.
Exactly.
Right? Because we all pretty much have family dysfunction that we are grappling with or playing a part in where we have to make everything seem okay enough. And so for me, it was by working with other artists and other directors that they helped me see, oh my God, like this is about your family. Or when I was writing scenes for either the play or the book, I'd write so many stories. So many things got cut. And my director was like, Susan, don't you understand what stays and what doesn't stay? I was like, no, I don't actually. Because it was just such a mess, right? You're writing about yourself and your family is such an onion, right? It is such an onion because there's a lot of tears and a lot of layers. But my director, Sarah, was like, trifecta, Susan, trifecta. The scene exists if it has what? And I was like, I don't know. She goes, Susan, mom, family. If it has all three, it definitely stays. If it has two, it's a maybe. If it has one, it's out. So that's where I'm telling you it's an onion. I already had a full narrative arc with the show. And yet when I sat down to write the memoir, I was so lost again. Right. And she was like, follow those beats. Because I was trying to understand structurally, how is this going to happen? What's included, what's not. And then I've watched the show again. And it makes me cringe every time to watch myself. But then I would write stuff. And then again, it was like, Susan. Because I was like, oh my God, I love this story. And it was like trifecta. Trifecta. And I was like, but my mom's like adjacent. And they're like trifecta. So it's so funny. It's like, I already wrote the show. I performed the show. I performed all the characters. And yet in the memoir writing, I was like, just like floating in space, you know, like not sure what to hold on to because family is so complicated.
Exactly, Susan. Well, I was very curious. This brings up a point because I always, when I talk to people who are writing memoirs, I always tell them to expect that their story will change in the discovery of their story. And it sounds like that's what happened with you, is that the story evolved or your focus evolved. I love that trifecta as a guiding kind of beacon for you to focus on. And another one is that on your website, you have a line that reads, "Heal the past, own the future." And especially since you mentioned closure and the concept of closure, I'm curious if you can say more about this and why it's central to your work.
I remember my editor would be like, "You don't know what it's about until you get to the end." And I hated it. I hated it every time she said that because I was struggling. I was so struggling for a while. And then when I get to the end, big surprise. Should I say it? Should I spoil it for everybody?
I don't know.
That to know me and to know who I am and where I come from, it's not just to know my dead mother. It's to know my living father, right? And I thought it was impossible to have closure with someone who's dead because they're dead. I didn't realize that, and this is the first line of the book, everyone knows the tragedy of the dead, but let's talk about the tragedy of the living. And I didn't realize how much of a central figure my father would take on in the book until I did get to the end. And that finding resolve and closure with him, even if we don't have the best relationship, because honestly today we're just like neutral positive. Like we're not like hella positive, right? We're neutral positive. Like we don't talk about the book at all, right? We pretend I don't do it. He's always like, "Why don't you become a loan officer?" You know? And I'm like, "What?" So it was like until I got to the end that I was like, oh my God, there's so much still wrapped up around my dad, right? And then that really informed like a new layer, a new lens on how to see the entire work and how to see the entire structure, right? This was not just knowing everything about my mother. It was knowing and having compassion for my father. And so for me to feel free in my own life, to live this intentional life, to be the mother I've always wanted to be, I had to reconcile the past with the dead and the living. And I don't think until because actually if you watch 140 pounds, it doesn't actually really hit the pulse of dad. Like you see the tension between Susan and dad, but it's not until you get to the memoir where you just kind of see more around dad and more around how much he holds the key to Susan's closure around who we are as children, how we understand our parents, how we love our parents even through their faults, and how we love ourselves and forgive ourselves through it all.
Powerful, Susan. It's so good. It comes full circle. And I do just want to put a plug to our listeners to listen to your audiobook because you perform it yourself and you do such an amazing job. So congratulations on everything. And really thrilled to have you on the show, as I said. So thanks.
Thank you for having me.
We will be right back with this week's Substacking.
So Grant, I wrote my Substack called Threshold Moments while I was listening to Susan's memoir. And while it wasn't exactly inspired by her book, The Manicurist's Daughter, it definitely had some related emotions. That Substack piece for me was inspired by the fact that this fall I've been living through a change, kind of sitting on the precipice of something, waiting or wanting to cross over. And so I was thinking about that as a threshold, and I was writing about threshold moments. And when I looked up the word threshold, I was actually actually interested to discover that thresh means thrash, which is not surprising, but I just hadn't thought of it in that way, because thrashing just so accurately describes this experience of waiting for that next thing to happen. And I imagine memoirists relate to that experience so much too, because, you know, it really is these thrashing moments that we go through that can be the fuel for wanting to come to the page and write our stories in the first place.
Yeah, that's such a powerful insight, Brooke. And I particularly like the part in your post about the thrashing. I really related to it. And it just accurately describes what so many of us feel when we're out of control, you know, when we're waiting for something to happen or for the next part of our lives to unfold. And I mentioned my daughter's breakup earlier in the show and how that's a kind of thrashing, you know, when someone else makes a decision for you, or you're waiting on others in order to make that next transition happen. You know, it's excruciating, but also, you know, this opportunity for growth, because this world is, you know, is always going to remind us that we're not 100% in charge or in control of what happens.
Oh my gosh, isn't that the truth? And, you know, I think that's why the thrashing is such a great visual, you know, when we're not in control and we're internally thrashing, you know, especially if we want one outcome and either we're not going to get it, you know, or it's not our choice, or we're not moving the needle on it. And in The Manicurist's Daughter, Susan wants answers. You know, she wants to talk about her mom. She wants to know what happened. She wants someone to pay for what happened. She wants to avenge her mother's death. And she has all these fantasies about what she'll do about it. You know, and it's just none of that really gets manifested because she's not in control. Right. And so it's like all of us are living these lives where things are going along and then, you know, something happens, threshold moment, a moment of change. And, you know, oftentimes those things are very pivotal and then it's uncomfortable. And I guess what I want to say about those moments is there is an opportunity to pay attention. You know, I'm going through this thing I'm going through. And someone told me the other day that they've learned to really love these moments, hard as they are, like to sit in the discomfort and the pain, because there's something very powerful about that reminder that we're not in control. I said to her, I have not yet reached that level of Zen.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe it comes with age or experience. You know, I guess I was thinking you get better at that the more experience you have, and also the more loss you've gone through.
Yeah, don't feel too bad about not getting to that level of Zen, because I've actually wondered if we do get better with the thrashing. You know, I just read this book on heartbreak, a hybrid memoir, and it's actually called Heartbreak. So I recommend it, and it's basically said that heartbreak can be as painful at 90 as it is at 19. You know, it's just the way our brains are wired. And so I suppose we might get better at the thrashing because we've been there before and we know it's not a permanent state and we know that thrashing is part of life, but it's still thrashing. You know, we have to find a way for the discomfort and the pain, you know, find a way to use that to illuminate life. And that's what we're here for on Right Minded, and what we're here for in each of our Substack newsletters. We want to explore the different kinds of thrashing that people go through, and we want to find ways to make that thrashing an illuminating, meaningful experience. So please tune in next week to keep this conversation going. We'll be here to thrash with you.